Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Trailblazer 2 Traveler. For the past 2 episodes, I've been showcasing my ideas for Luca and Natasha, both of which are burning units who can turn single target abilities into AoE ones. This mechanic I have since dubbed the Wildfire Mark and Wildfire Aura. For this episode, we're going to finish up the Wildfire roster with Seele. She's a bit of a different story compared to the other two, as she's someone who can't enable this effect. Instead, she will be an overload-focused off-fielder, but will still have a very strong synergy with the effects of Wildfire. Before we begin, just remember that there is additional information down below, and the captions are available if you need them. Without further ado, let's get started. Now, if you're watching this, I hope you've seen at least one of the other 2 Wildfire episodes. On the off chance you haven't, first, I recommend you do watch those other 2 episodes to better understand this video. But if you're just going to stick this one out, or if you need a refresher, here's a very brief summary on how the Wildfire effect works. Luca, or Natasha, can enable a Wildfire Mark on an enemy, which buffs the burning reaction. While burning is active on the marked enemy, they create an aura that works the same way as regular burning damage and pyro application in an AoE around them, but the radius is much larger. Additionally, pyro and dendro damage dealt to enemies within the aura spread to other enemies. More relevant to Seele, triggering a pyro reaction with any of the other 5 elements will spread that instance of elemental damage, and these are capable of triggering subsequent reactions. The trigger conditions are different depending on which element deals damage, but the gist of it is that under the right conditions, Wildfire allows single target abilities to become multi-target. Luca and Natasha are Pyro and Dendro respectively, so it's natural for them to have burning synergies, but I chose for Seele to be Electro, so she can't really enable a burning reaction effect like the other 2 can. So there's a layer of separation with Seele, but as we get into her kit, it'll become apparent that she's still very synergistic with burning teams. For a bit of additional details, it's also worth noting that Wildfire auras will linger a couple extra seconds longer after a burning aura disappears on an enemy. This is just in place because Seele will occasionally disrupt the uptime of burning via the overload reaction, so a bit of a grace period was put in place to maintain consistency with burning auras. On that note, another term that's going to pop up in this video is overburn. This is basically when you apply Electro onto a burning enemy, which triggers overload. This is very relevant because Seele's kit is designed around both overload and overburn. Now that we've covered the Wildfire stuff, let's talk about Seele's kit. For general details, we already know that she's Electro. I'm pretty sure this is the 3rd time I've said that. For her weapon, she'll be a polearm to match the scythe she uses in HSR. And for her Ascension stat, I chose to give her crit rate. Compared to other Electro units who attack very frequently, Seele is a unit who deals stronger but slightly slower hits. Critting or not critting can make a very big difference, so the Ascension stat makes her damage more consistent across the board. When it comes to Seele's kit, there were 2 main details I wanted to keep in mind. The first is how I was supposed to make an overload kit work well with the Wildfire effect. Wildfire's gimmick of turning single target attacks into AoE also implies that you're fighting 2 or more enemies. Usually, in these fights, the enemies you face are much more prone to crowd control effects, such as Overload's knockbacks. This effect is a very bad effect, because the knockback sends enemies flying away from you. You'd have to constantly run and chase them down, which is just a huge hassle to deal with. Second thing to address is that in order to proc the AoE effect, Seele would have to be the one triggering Overload, so that her damage can spread to nearby opponents. This meant I had to be super mindful of her elemental application, and strike a balance between which hits would and wouldn't apply Electro. If she applies too slowly, some of her damage might lose out on being AoE. Too fast, and she'd remove the burning aura too often, which also leads to less AoE effects. Her basics don't matter, so I'll start with Seele's skill. She will deal an instance of electro damage and create an illusory cocoon around the active character. This will last for 18 seconds. Enemies can freely pass through the walls of this cocoon until they take overload damage. When enemies take overload damage, they will have a slight debuff for 3 seconds. Hitting the walls of the cocoon causes them to be knocked inward towards the active character. When enemies hit the walls, Seele also gains an electro damage bonus for 6 seconds, which will scale on her talent level. This ability is mainly here to address the AoE issues with overload. If its main issue is knocking enemies away from the player, then we have to make an ability that keeps enemies in place. I always liked the idea of magnetism being used for an overload kit, and I still plan to use it for a concept one day. But in the case of Seele, her motif of butterflies gave me the idea of a cocoon that traps enemies inside. The cocoon is a reasonably smaller size, so it's not just an ability for hordes. Larger enemies or bosses aren't capable of being knocked back, but their bigger size still means that their hitboxes can hit the walls and grant Seele the electro damage bonus. All this ability is quality of life, damage buffing, and particle generation. Speaking of, Seele generates 5 particles upon hitting an enemy with her skill, or whenever an enemy hits the walls of the cocoon. This only happens once per skill use, and it's whichever happens first. Seele's burst is where all of Seele's damage comes in. For 20 seconds, she'll enter the amplification state, dealing an initial hit of electro damage. Afterwards, she'll immediately swap to the next character in the lineup, similar to how Chiori auto-swaps with her skill. Every 1.6 seconds, Seele deals electro damage to a single enemy, prioritizing the enemy that the active character is targeting. When nearby enemies take overload damage, and this can be from anyone triggering overload, not just Seele, she gains a stack of Resurgence. Resurgence decreases the interval rate of her burst hits by 0.16 seconds, up to a max of 5 stacks, which means she can now hit once every 0.8 seconds. Each enemy can generate a Resurgence stack once every 1 second, and stacks will disappear when the burst state ends or is reset. One of Seele's things in HSR is that she can deal more frequent attacks when enemies are defeated, but based on past experience, this mechanic can also be incredibly inconsistent. In a boss fight, for example, Seele's personal damage would take a massive dip, since there'd only be one enemy to defeat. There's a lot of ways to play around with the idea of speed and frequency, so I chose to make her burst an interval-based ability that speeds up as more overloads are triggered. I don't think we have a unit like that in Genshin yet, so yay me, I guess. There's a few things in particular that make Seele work better in the Wildfire comps as opposed to regular overload. Number 1, Seele is a single target damage dealer. Against bosses, this isn't that big of a deal, but in AoE, she'll want to be dealing damage to multiple enemies. To pull this off in Wildfire, she'd have to trigger overload against enemies within the aura to spread her personal damage to nearby opponents. 2, the condition on Resurgence stacking gets a lot better when she's in AoE scenarios. She can get a stack once every second, but it's also for each enemy. If you trigger overload damage to 2 enemies at once, she still gets 2 stacks, and so on and so forth for 3 or more. In AoE scenarios, you can heavily increase the amount of hits she does in a single rotation by front-loading stack generation. Because Overload has AoE already, she isn't reliant on Wildfire for this particular aspect, but if you're going to be using her for AoE, you might as well be running Wildfire to improve her DPS against all opponents. Seele's elemental application will have around a 1.2-ish second ICD, so when she has less stacks, she attacks slower, but can trigger Overload every hit. This is in place so that she can build up Resurgence stacks a little bit easier. When she gets to higher stacks, she'll start applying every other hit. At max stacks, her rate of electro application will go back to being consistently 1.6 seconds. In regular Overload teams, it wouldn't really matter who triggers the reaction, but in the Wildfire burning teams, it's a much bigger deal that Seele is the one triggering this reaction. Assuming you maintain enough Pyro and Burning auras, every other hit would trigger Overload, which also means only every other hit gets the AoE effect. This whole thing with the auras is definitely within the realm of theory, at least for my level of expertise. I'm not super sure how fast we can make electro application before it starts to overtake a burning aura. 1.6 seconds seems reasonable to me for an overburn team, But if we can actually get away with faster application, then I'm all for it. Faster electro application in Overburn does mean that there's a potential for more quicken uptime, and this means Seele can utilize aggravate buffs a lot more. Finally, following my general conversion of burst cost, Seele's 120 cost in HSR translates to a 60 cost burst for Genshin. Her rotations are still looking to be around 18 to 20 seconds, so her energy need shouldn't be insanely high. Still, I wanted to make sure she doesn't have any issues with that department. Let's move into her A1 passive, which will address that energy aspect. If Seele triggers Overload, she regenerates 2.5 energy. Yeah, that's it. This passive is super short and simple, and was designed to balance out Seele's energy needs in various team comps. For example, in Wildfire's Overburn teams, Seele will want to be the sole electro unit to reliably be the trigger for Overload and spread her damage. This means less electro particles for her and higher ER needs. This energy regen effect lets her maintain reasonable ER stats even in solo electro. This idea can also extend to solo electro in regular Overload comps. When you start looking at teams with double electro, however, it's possible that electro becomes the main aura, so pyro units might be the ones triggering Overload. When this happens, Seele wouldn't get the energy regen, but she also might not need that regen because another electro character present means more electro particles are going around. And in some cases, maybe Seele is getting Overload triggers in double electro, which means she gets the best of both worlds and ER needs are completely trivialized. For Seele's A4 passive, every resurgence stack she has grants her burst hits a 4% defense ignore. This means she can ignore 20% of the enemy's defense. This ability was mainly based on one of her traces, which grants a 20% quantum resistance penetration bonus. We don't have Res Pen in Genshin, and I'm not opposed to adding that in future concepts, but Res Pen is calculated the same way as Res Shred, and a lot of Seele's teams have sources of Shred already, so it felt kind of repetitive. Seele having a defense ignore passive just felt a bit more unique to her. It's also on brand for her because the only characters with defense ignore are Raiden, Yai, and now Durin, at least on their constellations. So that's mainly it for Seele's kit. The surface level details are super simple because she's just an off-field damage dealer who wants Overload to be present. There's different team comps you can play with her, but all of her best teams encompass one of two archetypes: regular Overload and Wildfire Overburn. These are where the details get a lot more intricate, so I'll cover the archetypes and how they both play well into Seele's gameplay. Regular Overload is going to be your go-to option for boss or single target fights. Seele's kit by default is single target anyway, so all you have to worry about is finding ways to boost her damage. Chevres is going to be a clear choice in these teams because of her Res Shred and attack bonus, which is capable of buffing off-fielders. This aspect is what makes Seele less synergistic with Bennett. She can't snapshot her burst hits, and Bennett only buffs the active unit, so unless you're running Seele in some kind of on-fielding role, she can't get the attack buff. She's very flexible with a variety of units. Her damage is automatic, so she isn't really going to rely on normal attack units like Clorinde or Arlecchino. Don't get me wrong, she still works well with these two, but she can also pair well with non-normal attackers, such as Veressa's Plunge playstyle or Linny's charge attacks. Mwah. Anyway, let's move into the second archetype, which is Wildfire Overburn. As mentioned before, Wildfire effects turn single target abilities into multi-target, so if you're running Seele against a horde of enemies, playing her with either Luca or Natasha ensures that she can deal higher damage to every enemy at once. Generally, Natasha will be the better choice since she provides some additional team buffs. Luca, on the other hand, is just a damage dealer, but he is an on-fielder, so you can run all three together and no one would be stepping on each other's toes. Seele was mainly designed around the AoE fights for Overburn comps, but since most of the mechanics with Overburn apply to Overload, things just naturally work out with her in those teams as well. She can technically utilize a regular Overload team in AoE scenarios, but since her bursts are single target abilities, she might feel a lot worse to play without Wildfire to boost up that potential. In the same vein, you can run Wildfire teams in boss content, But since the whole point of that mechanic is to enable an AoE effect, it'll function exactly the same as a standard Overburn team. As I've been doing for the past few videos, I'm not really focused on constellations anymore, so we're gonna skip that section. I'll just wrap things up with her general builds. I will keep it brief and focus on the main aspects, not so much the niche options. For artifact stats, we're looking at our usual attack, electro damage, and crit main stats. You'd also be looking for attack and crit on substats. EM is one of those stats that you could go for in a couple cases. In regular Overload, if Seele is reliably the trigger for these teams, EM can boost her damage in this reaction. If not, this is kind of a dead stat. In the Overburn comms with Wildfire units, not only is Seele expected to be an Overload trigger, the inclusion of Dendro leaves some extra room for her to utilize Quicken or Aggravate. EM can serve as a nice booster stat here, but attack is still going to have more value. Even though her Electro application has a reasonable pace, each of Seele's hits have higher multipliers, so the additive effect of Quicken feels more like a drop in the ocean. The difference in damage simply might not be as noticeable as a result. For artifact sets, there's only two noticeable options. In regular Overload, Emblem is going to be her best set, but its effects are also really hindered. As mentioned before, Seele's burst cost is 60. She also has her A1 passive, which heavily reduces ER needs. My general simulations predicted she's going to have an ER threshold of around 140 to 160, which is only going to give her a 35 to 40% burst damage bonus from the set. If you were to run her on extra ER stats, you can improve this bonus, but it would be incredibly overkill in the energy department. In the Overburn comps, Unfinished Reverie is much better because it provides an 18% attack and 50% damage bonus. Since the Burning Aura should stay present majority of the time, she should have no problem maintaining the full effect. For weapons, she likes having stats related to attack, burst damage, or crit. Many polearms can be good statistics alone, such as Symphonist of Sense. And objectively speaking, this actually might be her second best option altogether. The main issue with burst damage is that many of the weapons are tied to energy mechanics. Wavebreaker's Fin is slightly hindered because Seele, as well as many of her other teammates, have lower burst costs which reduce the damage bonus. Engulfing provides a good amount of attack with the ER conversion, but it provides around 80% ER, which is way overkill for Seele. Even a 45% ER weapon like the Catch is hitting the thresholds for her lower requirements. Then, for EM weapons like Dragon's Bane, Battle of the Fjords, or Scarlet Sands, they can work for her Overburn comps, but it's also not going to give Seele as much value as attack or crit. So when it came to designing Seele's signature, it really wasn't that difficult. Overload's been expanded upon over time, but none of the dedicated DPS characters utilize it as a main part of their niche. Seele's Light Cone has a crit rate bonus, as well as a speed scaling effect for all-around damage. We don't really have speed scaling in Genshin, so this was free game for me to mess around with. My take on Seele's weapon is as such: a 674 base attack with a 22.1% crit rate bonus. Whenever an elemental burst hits an opponent, attack is increased by 8 to 16% for 6 seconds. Additionally, whenever a party member triggers Overload, burst crit damage is increased by 12 to 24% for 6 seconds. Both of the effects have a max of 3 stacks, which means 24 to 48% attack and 36 to 72% burst crit damage. Since we don't have a character who's an Overload DPS, there wasn't really a need for a lengthy passive. Burst damage and Overload are the only two aspects that matter. Seele is dealing consistent burst hits, so she'll easily maintain uptime on the attack bonus. As for the burst crit damage, it's only dependent on a party member triggering Overload, so even in teams where Seele isn't a trigger, she can still get the passive. Other characters that come to mind are intended to be burst damage units, the main ones being Raiden and Xiangling. Raiden is the second best option, as she can function in Overload teams really easily. Xiangling can use the burst crit damage, but since she snapshots her burst, the attack bonus can't be utilized. Rosaria also snapshots, and a cryo unit in Overload heavily clashes elemental auras, so this wouldn't really be a good choice for her. Finally, building supports as DPS units can be an option for the dedicated players out there. Toma naturally fits into these teams as a Pyro unit. Meanwhile, with the right amount of application, Candace's Hydro Aura can possibly contribute to over-Vape teams, which is where a Pyro unit can trigger both Vaporize and Overload on an Electro-charged aura. Alright, that is it for my Seele video, as well as the Wildfire special as a whole. Burning is still, to this day, one of my favorite elemental reactions in Genshin. I've been playing around with the idea of a Burning rework for a long time now, since its special mechanic of applying Pyro opens up a lot of possibilities for subsequent reactions. Turning the Wildfire faction into a set of units centered around this rework was a very fun idea to try out. I also really liked exploring the different roles for each character. Luca, who's a direct burning DPS, Natasha, who's a direct burning support, and Seele, who has a separate niche, but can piggyback off the effects of burning's unique mechanics. Will I do this for every faction or region in HSR? I don't know. I have special mechanics in mind for Penacony, the IPC, and Amphorius, but for the Silvermane Guards, the Xianzhou, or Herta Space Station, I'm still looking for the alternatives outside of a standard 2-person faction mechanic. Still, I'm looking forward to sharing some ideas in the future. If you enjoyed this video, consider leaving a like and subscribe to support the channel. Let me know in the comments what you liked about Seele's kit and the Wildfire passive as a whole, what you would change, or any alternative ideas you might have. If you'd like to share more ideas with our community, consider joining my Discord server, link down below. Thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you all next time. Bye!